Who even are we? This is the question that will shape our worship over the month of September. And it's an important question for us to ask for a few reasons. We are blessed with a number of new people who have joined our community throughout this year, and people who may not have had a chance to immerse themselves fully in the community yet. And so this can be a great opportunity to learn more about this place and what makes it work, what makes it tick. But it's not just for new people. For those of us who have been part of this community for a while, or in my case, been here, gone away, come back again, it's always a worthwhile experience to be reminded of why this community is important to us. Why, when there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of churches in Sydney, why is this the community in Leichhardt that we choose to be a part of? The other reason is that on September 29 we will have our annual covenanting service, where everyone will be invited to covenant themselves to this community for the next year. And we'll talk more about what's involved in that later, but it is our hope that this sermon series throughout September will help set the scene of what you are invited to covenant into. Across the next 5 weeks, we will be exploring Leichhardt as Justice Church, LUC as liturgical church, LUC as affirming church, LUC as feminist church, and LUC as community church. But before we enter into today's theme of LUC as Justice Church, there's a couple of things that are important for us to be mindful of. These 5 markers are important aspects of this community, but it is by no means a conclusive list. I imagine that if we were to do this series again next year, we could easily identify 5 different markers for this community. And this is significant because, as important as each of these markers are for us, none of them exclusively define us. We are a justice church, but that is not all we are. We are an affirming church, and that is not all we are. And it's also worth noting that we've separated these markers out into the 5 topics that they are. But in reality, these things are all connected, interweaving together to shape who we are together. But if we were to search for an exclusive definition, just the one thing that says who LUC is, the best I could hope for would be that LUC is a Jesus church. We are followers of the risen, crucified one in this place, and it is through our discipleship that we hold a passion for justice, or for feminism, or for community, and so on. Ultimately, it is the liberation and transformation that comes from our relationship with Jesus that gives us the direction we take. LUC as Justice Church. Well, I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone here. This community has developed quite a reputation, I think, within the Uniting Church and also within the wider community circles for its leadership and energy that it has shown in a wide range of justice areas. Affordable housing, climate change, refugee and asylum seekers, homelessness, LGBTIQ rights, to name a few. And whether it be through our social media presence or our church notice board, whether it be through our work with Sydney Alliance or other church and community organisations, whether it be our turning up en masse to protests and rallies, whether it be causing a musical ruckus with our drumming troupe, whether it be our knitting beanies for the homeless, there is no denying that justice-based activity is core to who we are here at Leichhardt. But maybe the question that we should ask once in a while is why? Why justice? Sometimes our passion for justice is so ingrained that we might likely reel at such a question. I mean, what do you mean, why justice? Of course, justice. But perhaps we might also struggle to provide a succinct answer. But I'm going to help you out here because I'm going to give you my go-to answer. My answer comes from the African-American philosopher Dr. Cornel West, and it's something that I have constantly running through my mind. Dr. West says that justice is what love looks like in public. And that's really it. Our passion for justice is a public expression of love, the love that we find in Christ. It is as simple and as difficult as that. And let's not kid ourselves, it is difficult sometimes. Not just for us even, but throughout history, people have failed and failed again to remember the importance of living lives of justice, whether it be from stories in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and we're going to explore one of each of those today. Our first comes from the book of Amos, and I love this passage from Amos, particularly from a teaching perspective, because it is a great illustration of the importance of context. Because on the surface, it would seem that God, through the prophet Amos, is taking a swing at the very concept of worship. I hate I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. So if you're a person who regularly attends worship and enjoys music, you might right now be reconsidering your life choices, or you might want to know a little bit more about the context of this passage. Because as it turns out, the prophet Amos comes at a time when Israel is doing well. And by well, I mean that they are experiencing a time of economic prosperity. However, as such happens in these times, prosperity rarely means prosperity for everyone. Instead, it means a widening of economic class divides, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And so the wealthy begin to embody this position of privilege to the point where they begin to invoke the day of the Lord. Things are so good that it is time that they receive this ultimate blessing from God. To which Amos is like, no. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light. Their prosperity, their privilege has blinded them, because the day of the Lord would not be a blessing to them, but a curse, because the day of the Lord is ultimately about the full expression of God's justice in the world, that very justice that they themselves had turned their back on. So God despising of their worship was not because worship is bad, but because it was disconnected from the reality of their lives. It reminds me of what Jesus calls the greatest of commandments. We can't authentically sing or speak of our love of God if we do not also live out our love of neighbour in both our personal and our public lives. And justice is what love looks like in public. And then we move into the New Testament, into the early church, and we see in this letter from James this issue come up. What does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to live a life of faith? And much of this letter is about dealing with this issue around faith and works. And if we contrast this to the works of the Apostle Paul, he is fairly adamant on a number of occasions that we are justified by faith alone. And so if we take this idea and then we skip forward 1,500 years, this becomes one of the catalyzing factors of the Reformation. Justification by faith in opposition to the practice of purchasing indulgences in order to receive your salvation. And then if we skip again forward to now, this mantra of justification by faith alone in some conservative circles has mutated to become a reason to disengage with issues of justice and to throw out the term social justice warrior as if this was somehow an insult. I may have a couple of thoughts on this. First, I believe we should hold to the Christian doctrine of the justification by faith. I've said it from this pulpit before, you cannot earn or buy or work for your own salvation. It would cost us too much. But perhaps more importantly, it has already been given to us, freely and abundantly through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But our passion for justice doesn't, or at least it shouldn't, come from the basis of us trying to earn our salvation. Instead, it comes as a grateful response to the grace that we have received in Jesus. And we also want to take the concept of faith seriously, because if your faith doesn't actually change who you are and what you do, then can it really be genuine faith? Faith should be an embodied thing, not just something in our heads, but something that is in our hearts, something that flows out through our mouths and flows out through our hands and our feet. Faith that isn't lived out is not real faith. And I think this is what James is getting at when he writes, "Be doers of the word, not merely hearers who deceive themselves." Faith can't just be a passive experience. It can't just be a private experience. It needs to also be public. And justice is what love looks like in public. For James, it comes in the form of care and compassion for the most marginalised in his worldview, to care for the orphans and the widows in their distress. And we shouldn't hear this as a limiting idea that it is only the orphans and widows that we should care about. but rather it's a reflection of the larger ideal that Jesus shared in Matthew 25. Truly, I tell you, just as I did it to you, one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Or to put it another way, the way in which we love our neighbour is a reflection on the love that we have for God. There is one other thing that I'd like to say about LUC as a justice church, and it's more something for us to keep in mind as we continue to work for God's justice in the world, that we ourselves should never stop being transformed. If our justice work doesn't somehow impact us, then what we are really doing is just charity. Now, I want to be careful at this point because charity is important and addresses some significant needs in our world, but charity at some level is also about maintaining the status quo. It doesn't necessarily seek transformative change of systems. Perhaps a story might help us here, and this is a modern parable that you might have heard. And no one knows its origins for sure, but it was popularised by community organiser Saul Alinsky, congratulations David, in the 1930s, and it goes something like this. A group of campers on a riverbank are just settling down for the evening when one of them sees a baby in the water. He immediately dives in, braving the fierce current, and rescues the infant. But as he climbs ashore, one of the other campers spots another baby in the river in need of help, and then another, and then another. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of babies, the campers grab any passerby they can to help them. Before long, the river is filled with desperate babies, and more rescuers are required to assist the campers. Unfortunately, not all babies can be saved, and tragically, some of the brave rescuers occasionally drown, but they manage to mould themselves into an efficient, life-saving organisation, and over time, an entire infrastructure develops to support their efforts. Hospitals, schools, foster carers, social services, trauma and victim support services, life-saving training, swimming schools. But eventually, one of the rescuers starts to walk upstream. "Where are you going?" the others ask. "We need you here. There are babies in the water." The rescuer replied, "You carry on here. I'm going upstream to find the bugger that keeps chucking the babies in the water." Charity is doing the important act of saving the babies in the water. Justice is preventing the babies going into the water in the first place. Justice, real justice, means change. Not just for the victims of injustice, but for the systems that allow injustice to take place. And that's a lot harder because we often find ourselves immersed in those very systems. And so part of our calling to be people of justice is to be willing to engage and confront the injustices that we ourselves are complicit in. For example, when many of us gather for the global climate strike on September 20, we will be doing a very important thing in making a public statement about the government's inaction on the life and death issue of climate change. We will be calling for serious change in our country and in our world. But if we're going to have integrity, we also have to be willing to consider the impact of our own carbon footprint and how we too can live more sustainably. We too must be transformed. And that's why it's important for us to consider ourselves as a justice church, because we do this together. We're not alone. We can hold each other accountable just as we can support and affirm one another. And we can be the voice in one another's ears that says justice is what love looks like in public. That very love that we find in Jesus. Amen.